I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. So, first of all, for those who are following along, we're up to page 262, Lama Tsongkhapa's text. And we're in, obviously, we're in the section on special insight into understanding emptiness. And we're in the section on where Lama Tsongkhapa is explaining the meaning of the analogy or the simile like an illusion. And we covered this paragraph. I'm going to actually go back and just remind everybody where we left off, where he had been talking about what those analogies do not mean. He's going to say more about that. But then he says that the reason for taking these as analogies, he says in this paragraph under heading, or the outline is number 8, right, is that it's easier to realize that they do not inherently exist compared to other phenomena. Right? And so he's saying that it's easier to realize that, for somebody who's deeply contemplating and meditating on emptiness, Lama Tsongkhapa points out, it's easier sometimes if you focus on these on one of these analogies, right? So like that the Buddha gives, so like an illusion or like a dream, or like a reflection and so on. And so he's pointing out that that you can use those analogies or those examples of phenomena to see how they don't exist from their own side or inherently exist, and then you apply that to your self or to your body, your form, meaning your body or other objects and so on. And so he's saying it's a sequence, right? That you would realize it first in relation to some phenomena like an illusion or a rainbow or a reflection, but then ultimately you have to realize it in reference to your sense of I, right? Or to other phenomena. So now, Lama Tsongkhapa says, picking up where we actually start today, which is item number 9 there in the outline. He says, that being so, it does not have the same meaning to be in a dream and to know it, or to realize the appearance of men, women, and so forth are empty of those, and so forth, and what is said, and then he quotes the Abhisamaya Alankara, the Order of Clear Realization, says, even in dreams, to view all that phenomena are like dreams and so forth. And so actually what he's getting at here, he says, he explains it just below, right? He says, I'm just trying to find the right, okay, here we go. He's saying that if you realize your dream is a dream, right, like lucid dreaming, or if you realize that an illusory appearance is illusory, right, or if you realize that your reflection in a mirror is empty of being your face, right. Firstly, he's saying that's not the realization of emptiness. And then he makes this point. He says here, to realize that such things are empty of what they appear to be does not have the same meaning as the realization that they are like illusions and dreams that are not inherently established. Therefore, you should investigate well the uncommon manner of appearing like an illusion, which is set forth in the scriptures and treatises of definitive meaning, saying that something should be known as to be like an illusion and a dream, right? So he's again clarifying. Because actually, and this is important, because actually, if you, I mentioned this last time, if you read should actually read, like, for example, like Lama Tsongkhapa's commentary on the Six Yogas Miropa. He talks about this more. So he points out that that there are instructions actually, like in Tibetan Buddhism, where for lucid dreaming, for example, right? And for and so on. And what he's pointing out here is those instructions. He actually, in the Six Yogas, I think he says something like in that instruction in his book, The Three Convictions. He says something like, that's a useful instruction for beginners. Whereas for somebody who's never questioned their appearances, that can be a useful sort of, oh well, things don't always exist in the way they appear. But he says, but that's not how you realize emptiness. And the reason why that's important actually is that he points out, I think there, and others have pointed this out, that actually within the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, there are sometimes, people see an instruction like that and they sort of think, oh, that must be how you realize emptiness. And then they sort of talk about it in that way. And again, there are many instructions that are useful but not definitive. That's what he's getting at here, right? It's a useful instruction. It's not like something wrong to do, right, to practice lucid dreaming. It can be useful for the bardo. They say, for example, if you can recognize your dreams as dreams, then you have a better chance of recognizing the bardo as the bardo, and so on. But recognizing the bardo as the bardo is not the realization of emptiness. Recognizing dreams as dreams is not the realization of emptiness, right? And that's why he's saying here, you must investigate the uncommon manner of appearing like an illusion that's explained in the Majjhimaka scriptures. That's what he's saying, right? That there are many other teachings of the Buddha that don't get it. So when he's getting at, really, what does that mean? It means you have to understand what he got at earlier in this text, which is the very specific meaning of the object of negation. Right? Because otherwise, and he's going to get into this more in a couple pages, so I won't say too much, but otherwise you're negating something, right? But you're not negating inherent existence. Does that make sense? You're negating that dreams are real, right? But that's not a negation of inherent existence. That's a negation of. Then you would have realized emptiness every time you wake up and realize you were dreaming, right? That's not the realization of emptiness. And then he said, having said this, now, and here he's getting it. He said, I like how he puts this. So I'll actually read this paragraph out loud. He says, having said this, a child still unfamiliar with words who apprehends a reflection in the mirror as a face, a spectator who does not know about illusions and apprehends illusory appearances as horses and elephants and so forth, and someone in a dream who is unaware of it and therefore apprehends those appearances of mountains, houses, and so forth as real, resemble each other, right? Meaning they all believe in those illusory appearances. Then he says, on the other hand, an older person familiar with words, a magician, right? The older person familiar with words knows that the reflection in the faces of the face in the mirror is not a face, right? The person who in a dream knows it to be a dream, right? A lucid dreamer. And the magician, right? Who knows that the magical appearances of the magic show are not real. He says, also resemble each other in that they know those particular appearances to be untrue. And then he says this sentence, none of the two have found the view of suchness. So he's being very clear, right? So, if you're at a magic show and you think it's real, or if you're a magician and you know it's not real, in either case you have not realized suchness. You have not realized emptiness, right? So he's making it very clear there. Now he gets into an interesting point here. And I'm actually going to read, I think it's Sri Jeng Rinpoche's heading on his outline. He says, without the discrimination, it is this and not that. Due to a mistake concerning the measure of the object of negation and the consequent non-existence of the object to be analyzed and the analyzer, an appearance as vague and nihilistic is vague and nihilistic but does not carry the meaning of an illusion. So now Lama Tsongkhapa says, if the measure of the object of negation, which is what I was just talking about, right? We've talked about that many times now, right? What the object of negation is, what's to be negated when you do your reasoning on emptiness. So if the measure of the object of negation explained earlier has not been grasped well, and the object is analyzed by means of reasoning and broken up, the thought that object does not exist will first come up. Then the analyzer, who is also seen like that, since the ascertainer of his non-existence is also non-existent, any ascertainment in terms of it is this and not that becomes impossible. Then the vague appearances that arise do so in dependence upon a failure to differentiate between inherent existence and non-existence, and mere existence and non-existence. Therefore, such an emptiness is an emptiness that also destroys interdependence. Hence, even though the vague appearances arise induced by that realization, this is not at all the meaning of being like an illusion. So he's getting at a point here that's, I think, very important. He's getting a number of points here. Actually, maybe I'll read one more paragraph and then explain it. Because he then says, Lama Tsongkhapa then says, that is why it is not difficult upon reasoned analysis to think persons and so forth do not in the least have the mode of subsistence established on top of the objects by way of their own entities, and for appearances to simply arise vaguely in dependence upon that. Something like that occurs to everyone with an interest in Madhyamaka tenets who has heard a little bit of Dharma being taught about how there's no inherent existence, right? So actually, I think it's really fascinating, right? Lama Tsongkhapa is getting at, so he's saying, actually it's an interesting point, right? He's saying, if you really start getting interested in emptiness, you're going to have an experience like this, right? Or maybe you already have, right? He's saying if you really think about emptiness, you'll come to some kind of, almost like things will, I would say in English, sometimes you can say things will seem surreal, right? If you start, like if you listen to a teaching on emptiness enough and you read enough about it and you think some about it, then things start to seem totally like surreal to you, right? And he says, or like, how does he call it? Vague appearances, right? And you can even have thoughts like, wow, persons and so forth do not in the least have the motives of existence established on top of that by way of their own entity, right? You'll think like, wow, things really don't exist inherently. You'll have such thoughts, right? And then, and what he's getting at, and actually, and like, first of all, he's getting at something, a number of important points, right? One is, if you have that experience, don't think it's the understanding of emptiness. Right? That's one point. Second point, I love how he's really funny, right? Where he says, everyone will have that experience. It's like, so he's not saying there's something wrong with that then, right? But it's like, that's like a very preliminary sort of sign that, what that is a sign of is, oh, I'm interested in this topic. It's not a sign of something more than that. But you can see how, because the words, right, oh, things aren't inherently, if you have some thought like that, oh, things really don't inherently exist, right? You can see how you would think, oh, that seems to be what emptiness teachings are saying, right? So you can see how somebody might think, and people have thought that, right? That's why he's mentioning it. People have thought, I must be understanding emptiness. Things suddenly seem surreal to me, and I know things don't exist the way they appear, right? You have some kind of recognition of that. Or you have some recognition, oh, things don't exist from their own side, or things don't exist inherently, right? And he's saying you will have many different experiences like that as you start listening to teachings on emptiness and thinking about the teaching. And so first of all, you get it very clearly. He's saying that is not the understanding of emptiness, right? Then he's making a very important point. He says also that's not the meaning of being like an illusion, right? So if you say like, wow, things seem surreal and they're illusion-like, in the sense that he's saying it here, that's not the meaning of illusion-like in Buddhism, right? That's a normal experience that people might have, right? And he's making another point, right? He's saying here, that's now I'm going to go back up to the previous paragraph. He's making a number of important points. One is, why is it not the understanding correctly, right? First of all, you didn't correctly understand the object of negation, right? And therefore, your understanding is vague. That's one point he makes. Another point he makes is, you're, at that point, right, if you haven't clearly identified the object of negation, but maybe you tried in some vague way, and then you do these negations, right, that are the reasonings of emptiness. You start to get this feeling and thought, wow, things really don't exist the way they appear to me, right, or they don't exist inherently. But at that point, he says, you don't know how to posit dependent origination, right? And he says, so therefore it's nihilistic. It's actually a nihilist, and it's interesting because this is important, I think. At that point, people don't think, oh, I'm being nihilistic. Actually, people think, cool, wow, oh, that's interesting, or wow, things are different than I thought. You have some sense of wonder, maybe. And so it's an interesting point, right? What he's getting at is, underlying that experience is this kind of, what's the word? A level of nihilism you're not aware of, right? because you can't posit, and this is the important part, right? You can't precisely posit things lack inherent existence and they function dependently, right? You don't know how to posit that at that time. Therefore, it's not an understanding of emptiness, right? And what he's getting at, you see, he's saying vague. What's the opposite of vague? Precise, right? And actually, I'll just share this. Just, what was it, yesterday? Actually, I was reading actually a book by a well-known translator, who was translating and teaching about pramana, actually, valid cognition in Buddhism. And he was, so he wasn't translating Nagarjuna, but he referenced Nagarjuna in his introduction, and he said, he said something like, he was translating a work by Dharmakirti, who's a philosophical writer about perception, right, in part, and valid cognition. And he said something like, whereas Nagarjuna has no, what did he say? Something like, negates all reasoning, something like that, and doesn't hold position of any reason, any reasoned position. That's not what Nagarjuna, like Lama Tsongkhapa would say that's completely misunderstood. That wasn't the exact phrasing the guy used, but Lama Tsongkhapa here would say that's a complete misunderstanding of Nagarjuna, but people do misunderstand Nagarjuna, is the point, right? All the time it happens. Right, where they don't realize that Nagarjuna, his teaching is that emptiness is a synonym for dependent origination. Right? Dependent origination is a synonym for emptiness. And if we can't posit things that way, then we haven't understood emptiness yet. Right? And so there are many senses in which a person would think and feel that things are like an illusion or illusion-like, in meditation or in contemplation. And Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, everybody has those kind of experiences. They're not the understanding of emptiness, and they're not the understanding of illusion-like. And he's going to get into now what is, he already explained a little bit, now he's going to go more into what is the experience. And he'll say it in the next paragraph a bit. So I'll read that. He says, however, the difficult point is to achieve certainty from the bottom of the heart about negating all inherent existence established by way of an own entity and positing those inherently non-existent persons and so forth as accumulators of karma, experiencers of effects, and so forth. Since that collection of the two that enables one to posit them is next to impossible, it is extremely difficult to find the Madhyamaka view. So, and that's Lama Tsongkhapa talking. And I actually wanted to say something about this. I was actually thinking about it, and recently I was watching, this I mentioned last week, I guess it was. This is the 600th anniversary of Lama Tsongkhapa. Like this year is the 600th anniversary of his, something's called Parinirvana. Anyway, and I was listening to a talk. It was one by Bob Thurman, another by Thupten Jinpa about his life. They were they're sort of, because it's celebrating Lama Tsongkhapa's life, right? So various people. Thupten Jinpa has a book coming out, I guess in November or December, that tells the story of Lama Tsongkhapa's life. But he was, so anyway, I want to share something about that, just in reference to what he's saying here, because this is Lama Tsongkhapa writing, right? And so I want to share this, so Lama Tsongkhapa, first of all, he was he was a child prodigy by any measure, right? Like he could actually memorize books just by reading them, and he was as a young child. I think he was 6 or 7 when he did his first Yamataka retreat or something like that. And then he did self-initiation every day from age on or so. I don't know. It was I think he was 4 when he received the initiation or something. I can't remember exactly the age. My memory's not that good for that. But and then he was doing Manjushri practice, right, as a little kid. And he was said to be an emanation of Manjushri, right, they say. And okay, so then he traveled to central Tibet and he studied intensively for years and years, right, with the greatest teachers then alive in central Tibet. And one of his closest teachers was Randawa, who was a great master in the Sakya tradition. Right? Was one of Lama Tsongkhapa's closest personal teacher was Randawa, who was considered to be one of the greatest, probably either the greatest or one of the greatest scholars understanding emptiness, Madhyamaka, at that time in Tibet. So, first of all, and actually, Thupten Jinpa mentioned that he found they have letters that Lama Tsongkhapa and Randawa wrote back and forth, where Lama Tsongkhapa would be thinking about emptiness and writing to him, and they would write. It sounds quite beautiful, actually, right? the things they would imagine. What would they talk to each other about? Emptiness in their letters. So it's not that so one is it's not that Lama Tsongkhapa didn't have wonderful teachers of emptiness, right? And then I never knew this before. Tibetan Jinpa said at one point, like I knew this part but not the rest, like right before Lama Tsongkhapa's time, just before like one generation before you could say, was the first time that somebody had, that it was actually Bhutan, the great Buddhist master Bhutan. He compiled the Kangyur and the Tengyur. The Kangyur is the collection of the Buddha's words in Tibetan, like the definitive edition that continues to be passed down, and also the Tengyur, which are the definitive edition of all the teachings of the Indian masters that were translated into Tibetan. Right, so these two humongous collections of texts had just been published. Like you can imagine, right? Like after, what would it be, the 1400s from the 800s, right? So it's like 600 years after Buddhism had come to Tibet. Many different translations that were in existence. And so Bhutan kind of collected all those different translations and compared them and decided which was the definitive edition and edited them and published them as this huge collection. And at that time it wasn't, there weren't computers, right? So somebody had to then hand carve the wood blocks, right? Not someone, many people, right? Had to hand carve the wood blocks. So you can imagine the amount of effort that went into publishing, like an edition of the Kangyur and Tengyur, hundreds of volumes of texts, right? Hand carved wood blocks, and then you have to ink them and print, right? And it was hard to get a copy. Anyway, so this had just been collected, right? So then Lama Tsongkhapa, when he was in his 20s, he arrived at a Drikung Kagyu monastery that had an edition of the Kangyur and Tengyur, this new, like this precious sort of, these volumes. And it said that he stayed there for 4 years, mostly. He left every now and then, but he was like, wow, I want to read it. Like, you can imagine, like he was this genius, right? So he would occasionally leave to go study with his teachers, but he mostly stayed there and just read for years, and he would have these experiences they describe, right? When he would be at some place meditating, like he was this kind of person, like he was a great scholar, he wrote great, wonderful books. And then sometimes he'd be meditating and like they would be doing a recitation. And there's a story where he was like sort of sitting there and everybody got up after the recitation and walked out, and he was there in like single pointed concentration. And they were like, oh, just leave him, don't disturb him. They left him there. And then he kept not moving. So finally somebody like shook him and said, it's time to, whatever, go to dinner or something. And then, but he still wasn't satisfied. My point is that after all that, he still wasn't satisfied with his own understanding of emptiness. And he wrote commentaries on, for example, the Abhisamaya Alamkara that we just quoted. But he still wasn't satisfied with his own understanding of emptiness. Then he met Umapa, right, who was a great Kagyu master who could have direct visions of Manjushri. And Lama Tsongkhapa ran off with Bob Thurman's funny. He says Umapa was like kind of like a cowherd, kind of like a country bumpkin kind of person. Like Lama Tsongkhapa was already like, he was kind of like the equivalent, this is Bob Thurman's, sorry. I think it's just funny. He says like Lama Tsongkhapa was like the up-and-coming top professor at Harvard or something, like kind of that kind of person. And Umapa was like a cowherd kind of person, right? But Lama Tsongkhapa starts asking, Umapa comes to him and says, Manjushri told me to come find you. I can see him, and he told me come find you and talk to you. And then Lama Tsongkhapa was like a doubt, he wasn't like going to just trust, right? So he starts asking all these very difficult questions, like philosophical questions. And he knows that this guy Umapa hasn't studied as much as he has. But Umapa, like, he'll say the question to Umapa will turn to like that, and then give some answer that like is more profound than anybody else can give. And so he starts asking more and more difficult questions, and then he becomes convinced that Umapa can see Manjushri. So he goes off with Umapa for a while, and starts asking all these questions about emptiness to Manjushri, right? And still he wasn't satisfied with his own understanding of emptiness. And then he did a 4-year retreat. Like imagine, he went into like solitary retreat for 4 years, right? Not solitary, he had 8 disciples. Manjushri told him, take 8 disciples with you and go off to like the mountains and meditate. So he stayed for 4 years in meditation and had many visions of different Buddhas and visions of deities and all kinds of visionary experiences and insights. But I think it's interesting, after the 4-year retreat, he still wasn't satisfied with his own understanding of emptiness. So when he says here, it's extremely difficult to find the Majjhimaka view, like, I'll just share this. I thought this was very fun. This was very funny to me. Thupten Jinpa said, this was very funny. He's a Larampa Geshe, like from the Gelugpa monasteries, Ganden Monastery. And then he got his bachelor's degree and PhD in philosophy. His PhD is in philosophy from Oxford University, right? Anyway, so Thupten Jinpa, I thought it was very funny. He said, you know, we Geshes, we study Madhyamaka for a few years at the monastery and debate. And then he said, and then when we finish that, we think we understand emptiness. And then he said, but then if we look at Lama Tsongkhapa's life, well, he studied more than us, and he did 4 years of retreat, but he still wasn't satisfied. So the idea that we're satisfied seems a little, he was kind of saying about, he was very humble in a way. He was saying, like, maybe there's something wrong that we think if we're satisfied too easily. Right, he was saying, because Lama Tsongkhapa wasn't satisfied very easily. And I guess I'll finish the story then. Like, and Thupten Jinpa, I'll share this because he made a point. He said, you know, Lama Tsongkhapa was a genius by any measure. Right? I mean, he was just like one of these people like Leonardo da Vinci or, you know, like that kind of personality. You know, and everyone who met him had that experience. Like, I mean, people from all different parts of Tibet and all different traditions of Tibet, when they would meet him, they were just, what's the word, like, overawed or falling in love or thinking he's wonderful. I mean, like, you know, even like kings of Tibet wanted him to be their preceptor. He kept refusing. The emperor of China asked him to be his preceptor and he refused. Like, he wasn't interested in positions, but everybody kind of, he was that kind of person. You know, so what was he, you know, so you could ask the question, what was he doing then? Like, why couldn't he understand emptiness, right, for years? He studied it for years and years, meditated on it for years and years. And I like something Thupten Jinpa said, so I just want to share it, because I think it's related to this point that Lama Tsongkhapa is making, is, you know, the goal is not, and Lama Tsongkhapa has been saying this throughout this text, throughout this section, the goal here is not just intellectual, right? It's a psychological change, it's a change of the self, of one's personality, of one's, it's like an understanding of emptiness that transforms oneself, right? That Lama Tsongkhapa is talking about here. It's not like, can I, what's the word? Parrot the words, or get a professorship or something in this topic, right? He didn't care. That's why he dropped out, right? He could have been like this, he was on the track to be like this big scholar in that area of Tibet, and he left, right? He went off with the Upa, and they went off to retreat, and nobody could find him and stuff, you know, like, it was to transform oneself, right, through this insight. That's a psychological, it's an intellectual and an emotional and a psychological, right? It's a level of understanding of emptiness that completely transforms oneself. That's what he's getting at here in part, right? Because anybody can say the words, right? Like, dependent origination is emptiness, emptiness is dependent. Like, if you say those words, that doesn't get at the transformation you're looking for, right? I'll finish the story, I just thought it was very beautiful. So they say that Lama Tsongkhapa was in another place, like kind of in, I guess, like semi-retreat or retreat. That's not clear to me if it was in total retreat or semi-retreat. He was again meditating on emptiness, and I think I've told this, some people know the story, but he had a dream. And I think that's interesting that he had a dream. Like, this is an important moment for Lama Tsongkhapa, right? So, and you get the sense of psychological transformation here, right? So he had a dream, and in the dream he was in Tushita, heaven, paradise, right? Which is like Ganden, or is it Tibetan, Tushita in Sanskrit, which is the Pure Land that the Buddha had come down to earth from, and that Maitreya is now the abiding in, waiting to come to earth, right? And so so you can imagine this, Lama Tsongkhapa falls asleep, has a dream, he's in Tushita paradise, and he sees Nagarjuna sitting there with three of his closest disciples. I think it's probably Aryadeva, Bodhapalita, Chandrakirti, it was maybe that. And so Lama Tsongkhapa walks over, right? Because of course, what else would Lama Tsongkhapa do but walk over to them, right? And in the dream, Bodhapalita, who's like a tall, dark-skinned Indian, known to have been like that, a very tall Indian master, stands up and takes his text, his copy of his own commentary to Nagarjuna's Mula Majjhimaka Karika. And he takes the text and he places it on Lama Tsongkhapa's head to bless him, the way Tibetans do. They'll put something on your head to bless you. Indians do the same. And Lama Tsongkhapa woke up, like in this kind of state, and from this dream. And then I guess a few minutes later or something, somebody knocks on his door, or knocks on the outside of his cave, I'm not sure which. And he goes over, and the person says, I traveled here to make this offering to you. Here's a copy of Buddhapalita's commentary to the Majjhimaka, which seems like, what's the word? We would say synchronicity. And so Lama Tsongkhapa accepts the text, and he sits down, and he opens it, and of course he starts to read it. And they say that he turned to a line, I think it's in the 18th chapter, that says something like what we just read, what we've been reading. I say it's quite interesting. It says, the self is not the same as the aggregates, nor is the self different from the aggregates. Right? It's the exact line of reasoning we just studied, right? And they say Lama Tsongkhapa entered a meditative samadhi on emptiness and had a direct realization of emptiness at that time, where he became, Arya being. He realized emptiness directly. And then, so that's like the meditative concentration and space-like meditative equipoise on emptiness. And then you arise from that in the post-meditative state, and everything appears illusion-like. That's the time where everything really appears illusion-like, in the meaning that he's talking about. And they say Lama Tsongkhapa was so overwhelmed with gratitude that that's when he wrote his famous poem, the Praise to Buddha for the Teaching of Dependent Origination. It's about Tenjol Topa, like praise of dependent origination. And it was this expression of extreme gratitude to the Buddha for his unique teaching of dependent origination. And so my point is like, I just wanted to say that in reference to this one line, right? So Lama Tsongkhapa says, I'll just read that line again now in that context, right? So he's talking about being able to, actually I'll read the whole paragraph again, in the context of that story of Lama Tsongkhapa's own personal life, right? He says, however, the difficult point, right, this is his own experience now, you can tell, right? The difficult point is to achieve certainty, and think about this, certainty from the bottom of the heart. That's the psychological transformation that Thupten Jinpa was talking, right? It's not like when we say, I just think it's hard, right? When we say certainty, actually we often go like this, don't we? Like, I'm certain about it, right? But he's saying certainty here, right? From the bottom of your heart, about negating all inherent existence established by way of an own entity, and positing those inherently non-existent persons and so forth as accumulators of karma, experiences of effects, and so forth. Since that collection of the two enables one to posit them is next to impossible, it is extremely difficult to find the Majjhimaka view. So that's what, I just wanted to tell that little brief version, it's like just part of Lama Tsongkhapa's life. The point, when he's saying it's next to impossible, he's not trying to be discouraging, right? What he's trying to say is like, a couple of things. One is he's trying to say, don't mistake something less for that, right? Don't mistake something less than a completely certain experience from the bottom of your heart, and that can posit the two, right? The complete emptiness of inherent establishment, right, without an atom remaining, while dependent origination is completely clear, right, and functioning, and karma, and ethics, and all the different dependent factors, right, of our relational existence function in a totally clear way, where you can understand those two are in harmony. That's difficult, right? And what he's saying is, the point is, one is don't mistake something else for it, but also that's the most worthwhile thing to achieve, right? And it's the only way to realize enlightenment, is through realizing that. And I'll make another point he's getting at there too, just to clarify this, right? He's saying that we have to be able to, he said it earlier, we have to be able to differentiate between, let's say it right, the lack of, that when you say things have no inherent existence, that doesn't mean they don't exist at all. Right? And when you say things are, do conventionally exist, that doesn't mean they exist from their own side. And it's actually very subtle. I'll share one more. I'm just going off a little. Yeah, I'll say one more thought. I was actually having this. I was talking just. I often share little pieces of these conversations, but the other day what was it? Thursday. Thursday I was talking to my very dear friend, and he studies in the with a wonderful teacher, but and he was taking a class in Majamica, I guess, or in tenets. I'm not sure what, something like that. But and he made this point. He was saying he quoted the Heart Sutra. In the Heart Sutra it says no characteristics. Right? Things have no characteristics. And then he was really struggling. He was like, well, how can things have no characteristics? Like, he was like, like for example, my wife's a woman. I live in a house and it's white in color. My pool has water in it, not rocks or something. Like things have characteristics. And I was like, oh wow, I was like, he was like raising he wasn't giving those examples, but he was raising this point very like viscerally. He was like, I don't get it. How could things have no characteristics? Things do have characteristics. Like some things are nice and some things are unpleasant. And sometimes I'm in extreme pain and sometimes I feel better. Like things do have characteristics. My experience has characteristics. And I was like, oh wow, it's part of what Lama Tsongkhapa is getting at here. He wasn't differentiating between things have no, so we have to say it subtly, things ultimately have no characteristic, right? Things have no inherent characteristics, you could say. Right? Those characteristics they do exist, merely labeled by the mind. Right? And that's subtle. So just in that moment, he was like raising this question. I was like, oh, he's getting at the point Lama Tsongkhapa is getting at here, right? But this was from experience. My point is like, these are real issues. If you really get into studying and meditating on emptiness, then these confusions come up, these difficulties come up, right? And they should come up. And that's what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying, is that we have to then, that's what you say, right, that you have to become more and more precise and not vague in your identification of the object of negation. And that what's the word? Negating the object of negation does not negate dependent origination and does not negate appearances. It negates inherent existence. Anyway, so that's what so you can see. I just think it's very wonderful what he's saying, because he's getting at these points that people will experience this. Does that make sense? I think it's very a gift what Lama Tsongkhapa is giving us here, because he's saying you're going to have he gave a few, this is one, he's going to give more of these things. And what he's getting at is these are experiences that will arise for you, us, me, all of us. And we have to keep going. And we have to keep contemplating and keep doing this, and he'll explain more about that as we go along.
In the middle of that paragraph, there's the term inherently non-existent persons. That sounds like nihilism. It doesn't. Isn't it that the person does exist, but not in a independent manner? Because if I read this the way, at least the way I'm reading it, it says non-existent persons are accumulators of karma, but if they're non-existent, how can they be accumulator of karma?
I thought about that myself, actually, when I read that, both 2 or 3 times I've read it, and I would, if I were going to edit this, I would say non-inherently existent.
Right,
that's how I would phrase it,
sense to me based on what I understand, but I understand so little, so.
No, that's how I would, if I were the editor, I would say
Okay.
non-inherently existent rather than inherently non-existent. I think it's a better phrasing. I think it's I think the translator maybe, I don't think that's the ideal phrasing. I would say non-inherently existent for me.
That makes more sense to
Me too, yeah.
Is he saying that we're essentially that we have to be able to hold appearance and emptiness together? Is that what and that's what the real difficulty is, that we kind of keep swinging, but to either extreme, but that really we have to be able to hold, what he's calling karma, the appearance of the person, etc. But we have to hold, that's the dependent origination, but then the emptiness, we have to hold the two together? Or am I just making it too simple?
In part, I guess I'll complicate it slightly, because if you go on in what he's saying, and he'll explain more about this, that part of what he's getting at is that, which is again, I think is fascinating, is he gets at this point, he says, if you correctly identify the object of negation, right, and then if you have the ability, if one had the ability to meditate very deeply, right, so you meditate using these reasonings, then, right? So you identify, in this case, it's of oneself, right? So you bring up that sense of I that appears to exist from its own side, inherently, and so on, right? And then you apply the reasoning of not not one with the aggregates and not different from the aggregates. And there comes a point, he says, where one first comes to this kind of definitive conclusion that the object of negation does not exist. Right? And there's a kind of experience that they describe of space-like equipoise. And at that time, like one is absorbed in the realization or recognition, let's say realization, that the object of negation doesn't exist with even one atom, so to speak, right? So there's this experience that's like, they call it space-like equipoise, in which no conventionalities are appearing to that mind, right? And so one remains in that state, right, for a period of time. Then one arises from that experience. And again, conventional appearances appear to one's sense consciousnesses, right? So one sees a person and a teacup and whatever else, and one hears sounds and scent and all that. And then he makes this interesting point where he says, that's the point. So in other words, where one understands, oh, what I negated was the object of negation. And now, and he'll get into this more in detail, he calls it a remnant in a sense, but a mere appearance is arising. And one understands, first of all, that that's a dependent origination. One doesn't negate that at that time, right? Because that's not the object of negation, it's an appearance. And what he says is, let's say this right, that at that time one has the real understanding of the meaning of illusion, like, which is that these things appear to my, and he actually makes an interesting point in the next page, I think, where he says, these things are appearing to my sense consciousness as if they existed from their own side, but my mental consciousness knows definitively that they do not exist from their own side. That they do exist as appearances, but they do not exist inherently. And so the sense consciousness is having the appearance as if they existed from their own side, but the mental consciousness is realizing that they don't. And so at that time, one is having what you're describing as this sort of, how did you say it?
Union of appearance and emptiness.
Union of appearance and emptiness, in that aftermath experience, or the after, not in the space-like equipoise, but in the sort of after, one has this union of appearance and emptiness. And then he says that one continues to kind of contemplate and meditate in that way. And then, and so it's quite interesting then, isn't it, that, well, actually I left that one. One also sometimes has to meditate on the emptiness of emptiness as one is arising from the samadhi and emptiness. So, but anyway, so the point being, I guess, that that when one is in the meditative equipoise, conventionalities aren't appearing to the sense consciousnesses, but when they do appear, then the mental consciousness is recognizing their emptiness. So there is a union at that time of appearance and emptiness. So yes, in a sense, but it's like he complicates it slightly.
Because he's trying to get us to be very precise.
Precise in our understanding, so that we don't, because and again, because he's partly pointing out that, and actually he's partly pointing out also that he says that's the real meaning of illusion, and he makes this point. He says it's quite interesting, isn't it? Like that, that to really understand this meaning of illusion, like, one has to have deeper and deeper, continue it, or is experiencing more and more this experience of the negation of the object of negation. And then after that, one can have this experience of illusion, like, and I was thinking about that a lot sometimes, because, there are all these examples, right, where one can go around and say, oh, this is like a dream, this is like an illusion, this is like, but what Lama Tsongkhapa here is saying is, unless you're saying that in the context of having meditated on the negation of the object of negation previously, that won't come to the intended meaning.
You miss the mark.
Yeah, you'll end up missing the mark, And not that, and again, he's not, it's like very subtle, he's not saying that's useless or bad thing to do, but he's saying if you really want to understand the meaning of that, then you have to give rise to the object of negation in your own experience, recognize it, in other words, use these lines of reasoning to negate it, you know, and then you understand what's the intended meaning of illusion like. It's that there's this appearance to the sense consciousness, but the mental conscious can know it doesn't exist inherently, even though it appears to exist inherently, you know, and so on. Yeah, so I think that, does that
Thank
answer?
you. Yes, it does, thank you.
So I was going to ask a question like, so you're saying the six senses, consciousness is the one which recognize that is mistaken, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that means the only thing we need to know is the awareness. If you're able to be aware of that, like let's say a magician, when they create things, you know, it is delusion, like.
Mm-hmm.
So how do they know it when they're not using the six senses consciousness?
Yeah, no, you're right. You can only know, like, in other words, it's the mental consciousness for an ordinary person, for anybody who's not a Buddha, or for non-enlightened beings, it's the mental consciousness that understands emptiness.
Yeah.
I guess for a Buddha that's different. You know, that's a different thing. But for an ordinary person, and even for somebody who's on the path, then I think that you're right. It's the mental consciousness.
So my question is like, how does a magician know there's a delusion?
How does a magician know it's an illusion? Oh, because they created it, right? And they know they know how they created it.
Okay. So just like making food, like every day when I make my food, because I just create food, that means I already realize the emptiness, because I know I already created it.
No, one thing Lama Tsongkhapa is saying very clearly, though, he already said it, right? Whereas the magician who knows the illusion is an illusion did not realize emptiness.
Yeah.
He said that in the previous page, right? He said the person who knows their dream is a dream, they did not realize emptiness. So just if you knew how you made your food, then you'd not realize emptiness. Because he's saying that's not the object of negation. Like the magician who knows his illusion is an illusion, or her illusion is an illusion, they're negating that an illusory horse is a real horse. But that's not the object of negation. The object of negation is inherent existence, which they haven't even thought about yet.
So what causes people to believe that it is? What causes people to believe what the magician shows them?
What causes people to believe what the magician shows?
Yeah, the magician shows them things, and then they believe it. Like we go to a show, then they show us certain things, then we believe it. So I mean, how what happens that?
I'm not sure.
Because we believe it. We believe it, but the magician knows it's not true. But us, we believe it. But he hasn't realized emptiness.
Yeah, I mean, we tend to believe whatever appears to us, of course, like dreams. Like
Yeah.
we tend to, and I guess that's part of the use of those examples, right, is for a beginner that we begin to question what appears to us.
Yeah.
Because we ordinarily believe anything that appears to us, even though, you know, when we have that example of like the illusion or a dream, that helps us begin to recognize, that's what, you know, it's what part of what I was saying is that for those of us, you know, who are beginners, that we can start to go, oh wow, not everything that appears to me and that I believe is true. But of course, that's not understanding emptiness. That's just like a preliminary point. It's not yet understanding emptiness, though. Yeah. And Felicity, do you agree? So I'll do the next paragraph here because he said. So then he's continuing on the same point anyway. So he says, therefore, as you analyze suchness with analytical reasoning, you do not find production, and thereby negate inherent production. But you do not negate every kind of production, cessation, and so forth. If you did, they would become empty of performing any function, like the horns of a rabbit or the son of a barren woman. So I'm going to pause there, right? Again, he's making these kind of very subtle distinctions that are important. That when you negate inherent production, you are not negating every kind of production, right? And just like when you negate inherent existence, you're not negating every kind of existence.
What does it mean by production?
So production means like what's that? What's that? Here production, like you could give an example, like the typical example in Buddhism, but it's just, I mean, it's an example that one applies to all kinds of other things, is a sprout, right? Like a crop. So in other words, like if you go actually this time of year, I guess, right? Some places in the spring, you'll see like sprouts coming on in the field or in a garden. And what he's saying here is like, right, they use that example where they say, so they'll negate the inherent production of a sprout. But they're not negating that the sprout is produced. Does that make sense? So like that. So production means arising from causes and conditions. That's really what it means. So so what he's saying is things. It's actually it's very. This is why just in the previous paragraph he said it's extremely difficult to find the Machamaka view, because actually he's going to get into this later, so I shouldn't get too far into it. But when he gets into the emptiness of, we're actually still in the latter part of the section on meditating on the emptiness of the I. But then when he gets into the section on meditating on the emptiness of phenomena other than an I, right? Like there's a whole teaching that comes from Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti that Lama Tsongkhapa uses. So where you actually contemplate and meditate on the lack of inherent existence of production, and you'll often see in Buddhist texts they'll say non-produced. And again, like I was saying, my friend was saying the thing about no characteristics. The same problem, right? If you say, because there are some Buddhist texts that say everything is unproduced, and then if you were to read that and take it literally, you would say, well, wait a second. Everything's dependently arisen, so it's produced due to causes and conditions. Right? And so what he's getting at is, again, this subtle distinction. Things are dependently arisen. They do arise due to causes and conditions. And if you leave it on the level of conventional appearance, that's sufficient, right? Like in other words, if you were to say to a gardener, right, like, well, how'd you grow the tomatoes? Right? They would say, well, it was the right time of year. I got I got heirloom seeds, and I put them there, and I made the good soil, and it was. That comes from Shaler. I don't know about heirloom seeds. I don't know about such. I only learn these things from other people. I don't garden, but so like I got this kind of seed, and, it was the right time of year, and there was enough rain, but not too much rain, and so on, right? And then you would say, well, that's correct. Conventionally, that's a correct description, right? But in the section on inherent production, they actually say, you have to find the object of negation, right? The object of negation will be some idea of inherent production, which we'll get into later. I don't want to go too far into that. But that's where then they have this whole thing of, well, if things are inherently produced, then they have to be findable, just like the I had to be findable, right? So that means they have to arise from themselves, or from something else, or from both, or from neither, which we're going to get into in detail. And if you search, you can't find a thing that arose from itself. You can't find something that inherently arose from something else. You can't find, and so on. So what they're doing is they negate inherently existent production, but not conventionally existent production. That's one way of saying it.
And production is whether it's plant or things.
Yeah, or like you said, my parents. Like you were produced.
So sentient beings actually are also a production.
Yeah. Yeah. Anything that's produced due to causes and conditions, you could say. And so then he says, but you do not negate every kind of production, cessation, and so forth. Because if you negated every kind of production, they would become empty of performing any function, like the horns of a rabbit or the son of a barren woman. Now he says, with respect to what, now this is an interesting phrase here, with respect to what little illusion-like appearance would remain, the fault that all interdependent actions and agents would not have validity is set forth. And then he quotes Aryadeva's 400 stanzas, who says, if that were so, how would existence not resemble an illusion? And then he gives the commentary. once that which is dependently arisen is seen as what it is, meaning is seen as empty, right? As what it is means emptiness. Right? It becomes like an illusory creation, but not like the son of a barren woman. If one were to assert that through this analysis production is negated in every way, and that therefore the non-production of compounded phenomena is demonstrated, then they would not be like illusions, but rather something to be examined in terms of the son of a barren woman and the like. For fear of the conclusion that the dependently arisen does not exist, we do not compare phenomena with those, but rather with illusions, which do not contradict the dependently arisen. So do you understand what he's getting at there? I just want to really, this is important, right? He's saying that would be the problem. If one were to use in this context, if one were to use the metaphor or the simile, son of a barren woman, right? For phenomena. Well, the son of a barren woman doesn't exist at all, right? It doesn't appear even, right? There's no appearance of the son of a barren woman. So what Arya Deva and Lama Tsongkhapa are saying is that's why we don't use that simile in this context, and instead we use illusion. And why? Because it's interesting, right? Illusions do appear, don't they? You can't deny, right? If you have an illusory appearance, there's an appearance, right? And it doesn't exist in the way it appears, right? But so on the emptiness side, it's useful because it doesn't exist as it appears. But on the side of dependent origination and not being nihilistic, illusions do appear. And why do they appear? Due to all kinds of causes and conditions, right? If you have the mirrors or whatever it is that's creating the illusion, when all those factors are present, then the illusion does appear to us, right? And so he's saying that's a much better, what's the word? Analogy, right. It's a much better analogy. And he's saying, don't use the analogy here of the son of a barren woman, because then you would have some kind of, it would lead you to a conclusion that things don't even appear. But as we're saying, we need the sort of union of appearance and emptiness in our conventional life, right? And so that's where the value of this simile or this example of the illusion comes in. So that's a better analogy than the son of a barren woman, or they sometimes say the horns of a rabbit, right? Horns of a rabbit are non-existent and don't appear. The son of a barren woman is non-existent, doesn't appear. But illusions do appear. Dreams do appear, right? And as long as Dalai Lama said he thinks the best analogy, which I guess Lama Tsongkhapa says too, the best analogy is the illusion because it appears, right? And it doesn't exist the way it appears. And just so, dependently arisen phenomena do appear. And they don't exist inherently. So then he says, I think this is quite interesting. I'm going to read, I think it's Chichen Rinpoche's header here, because just these words are, I think, worth contemplating. So he says, although it would be a fault if a subject existed in the face of a reasoning consciousness, it is not a fault for an illusion-like aspect to remain as a trace of a negation by that consciousness. That's fascinating phrasing, I think. And I'll read now Lama Tsongkhapa's phrase. He says, and I guess he's quoting Arya Deva still. He says, therefore, upon such thorough analysis, since the inherent existence of things is not established, an illusion-like quality will be left as a remnant for each thing. Right? And this interesting phrase here, a trace or a remnant. Right? And again, it's fascinating, I think, because this is, Arya Deva, who realized emptiness, and Lama Tsongkhapa, who realized emptiness, they're trying to describe here a certain kind of experience, right? An experience for somebody who's realized emptiness, or whether it's conceptually or directly, right? But what's he saying? So he's saying, like I was describing earlier, right? In the So he says, right, like, well, actually, I'll go back to what Sri Rinpoche said, right? A reasoning, here he says, in the face of a reasoning consciousness. So what we're getting at, actually, and Chandra Kirti goes into great detail about this. So it's, how does he say it? I like, Jeffrey Hopkins uses the phrase ultimate analysis, because there are other kinds of reasoning, isn't there? Like, whereas if you were to say, you could use a very simplistic reasoning about, if you see smoke somewhere, then there's fire there, right? Something like that. That's not ultimate analysis, that's conventional reasoning, right? But what he's getting at here when he says, in the face of a reasoning consciousness, is ultimate analysis. Which means, does something inherently exist, right? So he's saying, when you're analyzing if the I or any other phenomena ultimately or inherently exists, he says, it would be a fault if a subject existed, right? So when you're looking to see if something inherently exists, you don't find it. You can't find it. You'll never find it. That's what emptiness is suggesting, right? So there is nothing, what's there to say? Under ultimate analysis, no subject is found. There is no inherently existent subject is found. Then he's saying, but it's not a fault, right, in the aftermath of one's meditative concentration, for an illusion-like appearance to remain as a trace of negation. So what he's getting at there is this, is when you identify the object of negation, right, like, so let's say an inherently existent, actually, like, okay, so an inherently existent felicity, so, right, if you identify that object of negation, right, and then you reason, you say, well, if there's an inherently existent felicity, that felicity would have to exist as one with the aggregates or as separate from the aggregates. And if you analyze that, you'll find no such inherently existent felicity could ever exist. Right? That's the first part of what Sri Rinpoche is saying there. But at that point, you weren't asking the question, is there an appearance of felicity? That wasn't the question being raised, right? That wasn't what you were analyzing. So you didn't negate that. Does that make sense? So after you reason and recognize there is no, and there never was, and is no, and never will be an inherently existent felicity, you can have that realization, but after your meditative, when you look, there will still be an appearance of felicity, which is left over. That's what they're saying, right? Because you didn't negate that. You were never trying to negate the appearance, right? And so you could say that's an illusion-like quality, which is a remnant left over, right? And then if you were to ask, well, how does that appearance arise? Well, it's due to causes and conditions, right? It's due to dependent origination, that there's this mere appearance. And you never negated that in the first place, so there's not a problem. Does that make sense? Because that wasn't what you were trying to negate. You were trying to negate, and you did negate, when you did the thing of identifying the object of negation, which is the inherently existent person, and then you said, is it one with the aggregates, is it different from the aggregates, and you found that it couldn't ever exist in either way, right? So you recognize that object of negation never existed and doesn't exist. Again, at no point were you asking the question, is there a mere appearance of felicity, right? So in the aftermath of your meditation, when there's a mere appearance of felicity, that's what he's talking about when he says a remnant or a trace, right? Is that appearance? And you would say the appearance does exist, right? And now if it appears, which it does to us, if that appearance appears as though it exists out there inherently, well, it doesn't exist in that way, but it does appear. Does that make sense? And that's why on the next, he says, therefore the apprehension of appearances as something illusion-like, interdependent, merely existent, is not a faulty apprehension of illusions. But if illusion-like appearances were apprehended as established by way of their own entity and truly existent, that would be a fault. Does that make sense now? Right, because you never negated mere appearance, so mere appearances, when they arise, so the person who's realized emptiness, when the mere appearances arise, they recognize, well, I never negated that. That's, as he say, something illusion-like. It's something interdependent. It's something merely existent. That's an interesting phrase, right? It's like a mere appearance, but it doesn't exist from its own side, truly or inherently.
So earlier you mentioned things ultimately do not have characteristics.
Mhm.
Can you explain that within the context of what you're just mentioning? I'm confused with it not having characteristics if there's remnant of something that does not inherently exist.
Okay.
Even
no,
at
it's a
that
good question.
moment, I'm thinking there would be a characteristic even though we don't label it. The appearance would still have some characteristics.
And that's what's important, is that the appearance, the mere appearance does have characteristics. It's interesting, isn't it? Like, I'll start with like the example of an illusion, then I'll use the example of felicity and go back to what I said. With the, if you're at a magician's show and there's an illusory horse and elephant or something like that, right? You could easily say, well, the elephant's bigger than the horse, right? Does either one, is it, since the elephant doesn't, since it's an illusory elephant, right? So, in terms of appearance, the elephant does appear bigger than the horse, right, in the magic show. But actually, in that case, there is no elephant and there is no horse, so it's not really bigger, because something that doesn't exist can't be bigger than another thing that doesn't exist. But in terms of appearance, it appears bigger. Does that make sense? So there is an appearance of characteristic, in that case, big, large, and smaller, larger and smaller, but they're not they don't exist in reality or truly. Going back to Felicity, using that example, then so we could say let's just say it right. Like, if you were to ask the question, does Felicity wear glasses? You could look and say, yeah, she wears glasses. Right? And if you leave it on that conventional appearance, that's not a problem, right? But in terms of, so that's a characteristic, right? Characteristic of Felicity, she wears glasses. But then if you engage in ultimate analysis, right? Like if you were to search, for example, it's just very simplistically. If you were to search the subatomic particles of the glasses to find something that's glasses, you wouldn't find glasses, right? So glasses aren't even glasses inherently, because if they were, you could find the glasses in the particles that make up the glasses. Does that make sense? So there are no inherently existing glasses. So a non-inherently existent person, whatever. Like, in other words, you can't find the inherently existent person, and you can't find the inherently existing glasses. So from the perspective of the ultimate, there's no characteristic. But on the mere appearance level, when you look, you say, yes, she's wearing glasses. If you were to, so you have to differentiate. On the appearance level, that's a characteristic. Okay? On the ultimate level, if you were to search for the truly existent person wearing truly existing glasses, you would never find that. Does that make sense? Kind of like, so again, we have to differentiate the conventional from the ultimate in that discussion. Conventionally, there are characteristics. Ultimately, there are no characteristics.
So, Dr. Lauren, so this illusion-like appearance, so is this something that remains with you forever, or is it also dependent on causes and conditions?
First of all, it's definitely dependent on causes and conditions. Even when it's appearing, even when we're, what's there to say? Even for, it's always dependent on causes and conditions. That's the first point. Because it's all these illusion-like appearances. Even magician's illusions, much less, the illusion-like appearance of persons and chairs and tables, and those all depend on causes and conditions. And what they say then is, but I don't think that your question is. Say more about what you mean by does it stay with you forever? Because I want to make sure I answer the right question.
So is it an irreversible process, or is it a reversible process?
What they say is this, is like, what they say actually is that for an ordinary person, actually I'll use the example that of the magician, of the magic show, right? Because I think that gets at your point. Like, so they use the tradition, and it's actually in Chandrakirti's Majjhimagavatara, this example. So he says, in a magician's show, right, we're giving an example of showing a magical show where there's illusory horses and elephants, something like that. So they say, the audience has the appearance of horses and elephants, and they also believe that there are actually horses and elephants there, because they trust their senses, right? Even though there's no horse and elephant, they believe that appearance. They say the magician, right, and that's an ordinary person. Then they say the magician sees because he's there when he does his own spell or something. They say he sees the horses and elephants, but in his mind he knows they're not real, right? And that's the example of the person, the Arya being. Somebody who has seen emptiness directly, but when they come out of that samadhi, they still have the appearance, an illusion-like appearance, but in their mental consciousness they know it's not, doesn't exist the way it appears, let's say. So the magician is like the Arya, somebody who's realized emptiness. But then they give a third example, which gets at the answer to your question. They say, then they give the example, they say, in a magic show, they have a person who arrives after the magician has cast his spell. And so for him, they say he sees like the magician doing these big gestures, and he sees the audience going, oh, like that, or something, but he doesn't actually see the horses and elephants. And they say that's like the Buddha in that analogy. So for the Buddha, those false appearances don't arise. That's what they say actually, that there's no false appearance anymore. So in that analogy of the three types of beings who attend the magic show, the third kind is the Buddha, is the example. And they say, so for that Buddha, there is no false appearance of the magic. And they say in the same way, this analogy for the Buddha doesn't have the experience of a falsely appearing and truly existent or inherently existent phenomena.
But the magician would have to rely on samadhi from time to time to kind of invoke that illusion.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. Then Lama Tsongkhapa, then he says the source of these points, right? So now he's saying all this teaching on illusion-like, where does it come from? And actually, if you read, it comes from many, many different. If you look in the Buddhist sutras, there are so many. Like the Prajnaparamita sutras are filled with beautiful, kind of poetic descriptions of these. Like there's that famous line, right? A star in the from the star, a visual aberration, an illusion, dew, a flash of lightning, and so on. That comes from the Vajracutter Sutra. But here, Lama Tsongkhapa quotes the Samadhi Raja, the king of meditative stabilization sutras, as a source for this, right? So he says, going through cyclic existence is like a dream. No one is born there, nor does anyone die. No sentient beings, or humans, nor life can be found. These phenomena are like foam, plantain trees, like illusions, like lightning in the sky, like the moon in water, like a mirage. Even after one dies here in this world, one does not move on to another world. Nevertheless, actions done are not lost. Their white and black fruit ripen in cyclic existence. There's no contradiction. And again, when you read that, now that's the Buddha talking, right? In the King of Meditative Stabilization Sutra. And if you read that, those 2.5 stanzas, actually you can go back and remember what Lama Tsongkhapa said, right? Where he said, it is extremely difficult to find the Majjhimaka view. You can see how that, it's difficult, right? In other words, if you read that quote, you would say, well, wow, right? Because when he says, one does not move on to another world, it's so easy to think of that as nihilism, right? As if there's no future lives, which is not what he's saying, right? And when he says, it's fascinating, right? No one is born here, nor does anyone die. Right? I mean, again, you have to, right? Part of this, and again, like, I'll share that, like, so many times these quotes, these kinds of quotes from the Buddha are misunderstood. It's very easy to misunderstand them. And, you know, it would be funny, like, almost like in your mind, if you're trying to really understand, you'd have to, what's the word, like, add in the word ultimately and conventionally, right? Like, so, you could say going through psychic existence is like a dream. No, ultimately, no one is born there, nor does anyone die, right? Why? Because under ultimate analysis, we could add like phrases here, and then you would understand it more easily, right? Going through psychic existence is like a dream. Ultimately, you could say, right? No one is born there, nor does anyone die. Then that's quite literally true, right? Then it would say, no sentient beings or human beings nor life can be found under ultimate analysis. Which is true, isn't it? If you do ultimate analysis, they can't be found. Therefore, these, you could say, these phenomena are like foam or plantain trees, right? And why are those analogies given? Well, one is foam is impermanent, right? I mean, like, you know, the bubbles. But the other is like a foam or a plantain tree, there's another meaning there, right? Which is like a plantain tree, it appears, right? But they say when you peel back the bark of a plantain tree, it's hollow, it's empty in the middle. And so what they're getting at is it appears, but under analysis, that's the peeling, right? You find, you don't find anything actually, right? And so those are analogies for that process of appearing, but under ultimate analysis not being findable. Then he goes into the other examples, like an illusion, like lightning in the sky, like the moon and water. Right, the moon and water is another common experience with it, right? It appears, but if you were like to search for the moon there in the reflection, you won't find it, right? But you can't deny, again, it's a good analogy though, because you can't deny that it appears, right? The appearance of the reflection appears, but if you search for something there from its own side, you don't find it. So it's another analogy for this kind of experience, like a mirage, same meaning. So again, even if one dies here in this world, again, when it says one does not move on to another world, it means under ultimate analysis. You can't find the person who dies, and you can't find, ultimately, you can't find the person, you can't find that it's empty of inherent existence, the person who dies or the person who transmigrates. And therefore, actions done are not lost, right? Karma, actions done is karma, right? Karma is not lost. Their white and black fruit ripen in psychic existence. There's no contradiction. So he says, when sought with reasonings that analyzes suchness, right? That's the ultimate analysis, right? Persons and the like who are born, die, and transmigrate and who withstand analysis are not found. Not even a particle. Nevertheless, positive and negative effects occur relative to illusion-like phenomena. You need to arrive at an understanding of such statements. And now, I mean, anyway, so you get the point. And here, I just want to say, overall, I think this section of this text is humongously important. You start to get the feeling of why. If he had just included the part about negating, finding the object of negation and negating it through reasoning, it'd be easy to, I think that's why Lama Tsongkhapa included all, I mean, it's part of, obviously, why he included this whole section on illusion, like, is, let's say right, if you just focus on negating the object of negation, you might not pause to contemplate how that does not negate dependent origination. That does not negate mere appearance. That does not negate, functioning of things, right? And yet, I was just going to, again, I'm going to go off just on a very slight tangent here. And yet, if you start to really contemplate these things, like, again, Lama Tsongkhapa who was a genius, spent years, right? So it shouldn't, it's not easy, right? Because if you start to contemplate things, you'll want to say, actually, first of all, you'll want to say, but it's real from its own side, then, right? That which you'll want, like, and actually, Lama Tsongkhapa here is presenting what, the Madhyamaka Prasangika view, right? And part of it, if you just understand how this is, all the other Buddhist philosophical tenet systems assert that there's something existing from the side of the object, at least conventionally, that there's something there from the side of the object in order to be dependently arisen. Only Prasangikas say no, dependent origination means there is not something inherently existent from the side of the object. It's unique. It's a unique tenet of the Prasangika Madhyamaka philosophical school. Chandrakirti's system. So even, from Chandrakirti's perspective, even all other Buddhist philosophers subtly misunderstood this point. He disagrees with them, actually, on this point. So, and of course, Lama Tsongkhapa is following Chandrakirti in his interpretation. Okay, so now actually we're going to get into one more. Remember I was saying earlier, I think it's very useful. So I was saying earlier, Lama Tsongkhapa is getting at these ways that people who are interested in this topic and serious about emptiness misunderstand it, right? So he is going to give another of these. And so it's quite useful because, again, like, if you're, if you get really interested in meditating on emptiness and contemplating emptiness, why is he sharing these? Because you'll probably have these experiences, right? And he's trying to help us know, well, what's going on. And this one I think is very profound. I think there's a lot you can contemplate from this. Let's read through what he says and then talk about it a little bit. So he says, moreover, some do not place and sustain the mind within the view that has come to a decisive conclusion in meditative equipoise about the mode of being, but so they don't do that, right? They don't identify, he's saying that, right? Moreover, some people do not, which I was describing when you asked right, about this meditative samadhi on emptiness, on the lack of inherent establishment, right? So he says, some people don't do that, right? They don't place and sustain the mind within the view, meaning emptiness, right? That has come to a decisive conclusion in meditative equipoise. Some people don't do that about the mode of being, right? So it means mode of being and view means emptiness, right? So he's saying, but instead, these people, gain a stable, mere single-pointedness in which the mind does not apprehend anything at all, right? So instead, such people sort of think, so you can imagine, somebody would sit down, they can meditate fairly deeply, they've practiced meditation for a while, so they can sort of have some kind of concentration, and then they might just meditate on, first of all, there are many people, I'm going to give a couple of examples of this, that really you could do easily. One is that many people, actually, if you see, like, there's so many people who think of Buddhism this way, where they just go, like, they say just, like, stop all conceptual thoughts, right? Or, like, empty your mind, right? Or, don't think of anything. That's one version of what he's talking about. Right? There's another version, though, that you could do that's a little bit, now, actually that's hugely common, right? If you go around, like, many, many people, right now, if you go where people would say that's what Buddhism is saying to do. Lama Tsongkhapa disagrees with that, of course. But then there's another version of that, right, where a person can just go, like, if you're not precise, right, because a decisive conclusion about emptiness, right? But there's another example of this where you can just sit down, if you're more subtle than that, right, where you can just say, you can sit down in your meditative concentration and just go, oh, nothing exists inherently. Everything's empty. And then your mind just kind of goes into a kind of empty appearance, where you didn't identify the object of negation, though, and you didn't refute it, right? So it's just kind of the sense of, like, everything's empty, like that, and then your mind becomes kind of empty, right? So he said, so if you did something like that, he says, through its power, when they arise from that kind of concentration, appearances, such as of a mountain, appear insubstantial like a rainbow, or thin smoke, rather than hard and obstructive as they appeared before. So he's saying this can happen for you if you go on retreat, right? If you do like it can happen if you go on a week-long retreat or something, right? And again, it's very easy to do that, right? Like, I think people who have come, there are many Buddhists who would do this. I think people who have come to like the center and studied Lama Tsongkhapa's teachings, they probably wouldn't just say, oh, just empty your mind, and that's emptiness, right? But it would be easy for us even to say, just to like not go through the whole process that Lama Tsongkhapa is describing, but just go, like at the second version of what I said, oh, everything's empty. And they might even, like you said earlier, go, wow, like, you know, you didn't identify the object of negation really, but you just kind of go, wow, like, I don't really exist. And then you kind of space out in that space of thinking I don't really exist. Well, that's what he's describing here, right? And then he's saying, if you do that for a while and you meditate on it enough, then things will start to appear to you as if they're unobstructive. Like, again, almost like surreal and hazy, like smoke, he says. So like to yourself, you'll appear like some kind of, what's the word, like, unless you haven't, like, where you'll almost feel like you could put your hand through the wall, right? Things will seem, what's the word, like, kind of unreal and unobstructive. Yeah, as if you could put your hand through a wall, or as if you could like float, or as if like even your body isn't sort of, it's like almost as if it's like smoke or like a rainbow, right? And it'll seem like everything's like that. You could look at trees and mountains even. It would seem as if they're just sort of like an illusion, or like a, like a rainbow or something. Then he says, this is also not the illusion-like appearance explained in the scriptures, because it is an appearance of objects as empty of gross obstructiveness, rather than the appearance of objects as being empty of inherent establishment, or being inherently established. Right? And so, first of all, he's giving another reason, another meaning, another experience, and he's saying, things will, if you have that experience of things seeming kind of like unobstructed, as if you could put your hand through a wall, and as if everything isn't really solid, and oftentimes people say that, oh wow, like everything seems so not solid, it doesn't seem solid anymore, something like that. People will talk that way sometimes. So first of all, he's saying that's not emptiness. And that's not the meaning of illusion-like that is being discussed in the Buddhist scriptures. Okay? Actually, I'll finish and then I'll say another point. Then he says, also the meaning of emptiness, which is the absence of inherent existence, cannot possibly be the non-existence of obstructive hardness. Right? And what he's getting at, he says, otherwise there will be the fault that when apprehending rainbows and like as a substrata, it would become impossible for an apprehension of true existence to arise. Basically, that anybody, if just recognizing that certain things aren't physically obstructive, cause the realization of emptiness, then every time somebody saw a rainbow, they would realize emptiness. Right? He's saying that's ridiculous. That's not the meaning of emptiness. So first of all, I just want to say a couple comments on this, because I think this is a fascinating paragraph. One is, it's really easy to do that kind of vague meditation on emptiness, where then you just kind of empty your mind. Then things will seem kind of unobstructive to you, or illusion-like to you, although it's not the meaning of illusion-like in Buddhism, or they'll seem like rainbows, but that's not the meaning of emptiness. Another point I just wanted to share, to think about for a moment, is what he's getting at there is what, actually, is such a person, right, negated a different object of negation. That's what he's saying, right? They negated obstructiveness, right? And so if you negate obstructiveness, in a way, then things seem unobstructive to you. And if you contemplate that a little bit, there's an implication I think is just interesting to think about, which is, this is why Lama Tsongkhapa is getting into so much detail and emphasizes so much identifying the correct object of negation, is you could negate a lot of different things in your meditation other than emptiness, other than inherent existence, rather, and then you're not realizing emptiness, right? Like, so if you meditate on, let's say, if your object of negation is permanence, for example, right? Well, things are impermanent, right? But we don't recognize that. So if you identify how you hold on to things as permanent, and then you correctly meditate, it's correct, things are not permanent, you'll eventually realize that things are impermanent, experientially, right? But that's not emptiness. Does that make sense? But things will seem different to you, in a good way. You'll be less attached, you'll be more relaxed, you'll be more realistic, and that's all good, but that's not emptiness, right? You could even negate, like he doesn't say this here, but in other text, many lamas point this out, right? You could negate the existence of a substantially existent self. That's the topic that some Buddhist schools talk about. And that's useful, but that's not the object of negation for Prasangika view. So there are many different objects of negation that you could sort of identify experientially and negate using correct reasoning, which would give you some kind of interesting experience, and maybe sometimes, in some cases, useful experience, but only if you find the object of inherent existence and negate it will you be realizing emptiness. Does that make sense? And if you negate any other object, that's not a realization of emptiness, it's some other experience. And Tsongkhapa here is just, Lama Tsongkhapa is just pointing out there are many different kinds of experiences we can have, but the correct understanding of emptiness comes when you've negated inherent existence, and the sign that you've done that correctly is that you can understand the harmony of mere appearances, that's dependent origination, while things lack inherent nature. And that you have this experience where you know and feel, how do you say it, to the depths of your heart, right? That things lack even an atom of inherent establishment or existence from their own side, and they appear due to causes and conditions, and karma and causality function while lacking inherent establishment, and things lack inherent establishment while appearances function due to dependent origination. And until we have that kind of mutually reinforcing experience, we're not quite there yet.
I'm not sure it was here. The concept of the focus being impermanence. I guess I'm an incrementalist at heart. And does he talk about that there's steps? Because going directly to focusing on inherent existence seems to be a bigger leap than going to the fact that I know this phone is impermanent, that 1,000 years from now, nothing will exist at all about this phone, versus the inherent existence of you.
That's much harder.
Right.
Yeah.
Does it make sense to try to do it when, as you said, meditating on a blank space is relatively simple,
Yeah.
empty one's mind, but that doesn't get you a lot of places. Are there steps that, versus making just the one big leap?
Well, one point, I'll say two answers to your question. Like one is, one answer to your question is, I think that's the reason why this is the last section of the book, in one way. It's like, if you think of the Lam Rim, he's saying, and he puts it last for a reason, which is that you've already realized, actually, impermanence comes in the low scope section, one meditates on impermanence, for example. So one point is that I think it comes last in the Lam Rim for that reason, in a way, of what in terms of what you're getting at. And even like whenever I've talked to like great Tibetan lamas about this, they'll often say like, one really focuses on all the meditations up to realizing bodhicitta first. So from low scope, middle scope, and then great scope, up to the point of realizing bodhicitta, and then one sort of goes off, Tibet, that's what they do actually. Then they go off and do their retreat on emptiness and deity yoga combined with emptiness or whatever. So that's one point, I think that's why it comes last in the long run. But another point, getting at, I think also is what you're implying or getting at, is, and Lama Tsongkhapa doesn't do that in this text, but in the texts on tenets, right, tenet systems in Buddhism, and this, the way Gelugpa lamas and Lama Tsongkhapa kind of present that, and you'll see it even in his in Lama Tsongkhapa's Essence of True Eloquence, but then in all the different other subsequent books on tenets, the way that's sort of described is that they start, they put them in a certain order, where they start with the Vaibhashikas, and then the Sautantrikas, and then the Chitamatrans, the mind-only school, and then the Madhyamikas, and they have first the Svatantrika Madhyamika and then the Prasangika Madhyamika. And I think that's getting at what you're getting at too, that one reason why they do it in that order is there's a recognition that, they sometimes it says this actually, that for people of extremely sharp faculties or something, that one can go directly to the Prasangika position, because that's the ultimately most definitive view of the Buddha, they call it the definitive view of the Buddha. But they'll often say, like, those other tenet systems are not, they are teachings of the Buddha, and they're correct, they're good teachings, in the sense that, and they often, like, Lama Tsongkhapa himself says that, he says it's for, they have different phrases, they sometimes say, for someone for whom the Prasangika view would be too frightening, for example, or too disturbing, or too mentally difficult, or something, that one can choose another of those tenet systems to meditate on, for example, knowing you eventually have to come to the Prasangika view. And even if you look actually at the, if you look like at the monastic, the way the monks, the nuns too now, in the nunneries and the monks in the monasteries, like when they do the formal study of like the treatises, the great treatises, it's interesting, like the Madhyamaka teachings of Chandrakirti come fairly late, actually. Like they spend years first studying other texts, and if you look at the tenet systems that those other texts come from, they're not the Prasangika. Like, they spend years studying the Abhidharma, which actually comes from the, they debate it, but most like they study Vasubandhu's Abhidharma text, which is mostly from the Satantrika perspective, and a little bit from the, a little bit of that seems to have some Chinamantra, mind-only school perspective, maybe, I'm not sure about that, but, and then, they spend years studying the Abhisamaya Alamkara, which, although it has a Prasangika element to it, doesn't emphasize that point, and can be presented from other perspectives, and they study other teachings of Maitreya, which are grounded in the mind-only school perspective, and so on. So they study many other topics before they get to even the study of Chandrakirti's interpretation and Nagarjuna's text and these texts, the ultimate, perspective. And I think that's for that reason, that they've studied all these other topics and contemplated them and meditated on them, so that when they get to this, the Prasangika view, they already have those other, some familiarity with those other things. So I think that's two different answers. One is in the Lamrim itself, it comes later, but the other is if you look at the tenets teachings, they sometimes say they're like a stairway, and that, some people, I guess, can understand the Madhyamaka view quite quickly, but they teach the tenet systems partly to help one sort of get, be able to gradually come to an understanding of what is Chandrakirti explaining and why.
So they do it in a step function.
Yeah, they do that in a stage function, which Lama Tsongkhapa always is emphasizing, this kind of gradual. He's very much presenting things in a gradualist way, explaining steps. So in this Lamrim, it comes late, but also in those teachings, it's like they go from the least subtle to the most subtle presentation of view.
Right.
Yeah.
I just have a thing. So I'm thinking, when we say Dharma, is Dharma exist on its own side or not? Or is that a wrong view?
It's an interesting question. Like, does Dharma exist from its own side? Is that your question? Yeah, that's a good question, actually. That's interesting. Yeah, from a Buddhist perspective, they would say, the Buddha himself actually, I think would say, I believe the Buddha would say, Dharma is also dependently arisen and therefore not inherently existent. Because even emptiness, for example, they say even emptiness is empty. Right? Even the Buddha is empty, the Dharma is empty, the Sangha is empty of inherent existence. So the Buddha even said that. Actually, there are like teachings like 16 type. There are lists. I can't remember all. One is 16, but there are other lists of like different, like sometimes say types of emptiness. But what they mean is kinds of things that are empty. So because he's making a point of saying even emptiness is empty. Like they give an example. It's not that they're all different emptinesses. Emptiness always has the same flavor. But the Buddha makes a point of even saying he includes in the list emptiness itself is empty, because if you grasp at emptiness as something, what's the word, inherently existent, then actually Nagarjuna says that's particularly bad, because then emptiness is supposed to be antidote to grasping inherent existence. So if somebody were to grasp at emptiness as inherent existence, then it's quite difficult to help that person, because you're explaining emptiness and they're going to become more and more grasping or something. So so I think according to the Buddhism, according to Buddhism, you would say that even the Dharma itself is dependently arisen and empty of inherent existence, which doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It does appear, right? Just like we're saying, it appears due to causes and conditions, but it's not inherently existent. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, it's hard.
But I think actually I'll just make a comment. I think it's very, like, let's just say, right? I think it's normal. I guess I don't know if you're doing this, but I'll just say I think it's normal that we like. It's like, the mind-only school, for example, right, says, according to Lama Tsongkhapa, the mind-only school has this view that, say, consciousness is inherently existent, that it exists from its own side. And actually, I just pause. If you think about it, you can see the attractiveness of that. I mean, they're not saying Dharma does; they're saying consciousness does. But you can see the attractiveness because, like, I don't know how to say it right. It's like one wants something to exist inherently, or there could come this feeling of like, where one wants, and so that's why I think the tenet systems are useful in a way. Is like they get at each tenet system. In a way, the difference from the Prasangika is that each of the other tenet systems asserts that something exists from its own side. And it's only the Prasangika school that says nothing does, even conventionally. That things exist conventionally, but they don't exist from their own side conventionally, is what the Prasangika says, right? But you can see how, like, what's you say, right? You can see why there's that's the Prasangikas themselves say that the Buddha taught those other systems because it's difficult, and because, like, to get closer and closer to this ultimate view of the Buddha, that there can be a usefulness in sort of, I don't know, like, you can almost imagine somebody starting off by saying, well, this, like, so for example, like one of the lower tenet systems says, there are, like, what's the word, indivisible atoms and indivisible moments. And you can see how for somebody that could feel grounding in a way. It's like, well, okay, that exists. So they would say, does your body inherently exist? No, but those atoms that make it up do. And does your consciousness inherently exist? They would say no, but the moments of consciousness, like over time, of course, it's like labeled on a sequence, but those moments are indivisible, and you can see the attractiveness of that. And then, of course, eventually somebody says, well, then for example, the mind-only school then says, you can see the attractiveness and the usefulness of that view, because then you can start to question other things existing independently, like the person, because they would say the person is selfless, right? But the atoms exist, for example, right? And then the mind-only school comes along and says, well, wait a second. If atoms are indivisible, but they exist and they accumulate, they have to have sides, right? If you're going to accumulate atoms next to each other, there has to be one on this side and one on that side. So if there's sides, then it's not indivisible. There's the right and the left, or east and south. So then they're divisible again. Which is what particle physics would say. That there is no indivisible. But anyway, they start to, like, argue. The mind-only school argues that way, and then of course the person has to kind of, if they listen to the mind-only school's arguments, they're valid actually. They're good arguments. You start to say, well, there are no indivisible atoms. But then the mind-only school gives something else to hold on to. If it's different, the mind, consciousness or something. And so you can see the usefulness of going, okay, well, all external objects don't, aren't, I guess don't exist actually, don't exist separate from the mind, you'd say, and the person is, is empty. But but they would still be a kind of holding on to consciousnesses, and so on. But you can see the use of that, as a kind of going back to this point about gradual steps. I'm just kind of staying on that point, until eventually the Prasangika school has this most subtle presentation that Lama Tsongkhapa is presenting. But again, I want to emphasize this point though. Probably the most important point that Lama Tsongkhapa is making here is actually, the most important point is this, is that he's making is, you know, how does he say it? Things do exist, right? Karma exists, right? An accumulator of karma exists. You know, the path, and actually it's very important, the path, right? I mean, the Dharma, like, so the path exists, the result exists. And actually it's interesting, I'll just share, I'm going off on little tangents here, but I'll say one more point. Somebody criticizes Nagarjuna at one point, in one of his texts, I can't remember which one, but somebody sort of presents a critique of Nagarjuna where they say to Nagarjuna, if things lack true existence, which is another way of saying inherent existence, right? Like they say, then according to you, they're sort of debating with Nagarjuna. Right? So they say, according to you, things lack any inherent existence. Therefore, there's no, or true existence. Therefore, there's no path. There's no Dharma. There's no Buddha. There's no goal. There's no, there's no achievement of enlightenment. And Nagarjuna says something very interesting to them. He says, actually, it's the opposite. He says, if things inherently existed, if you inherently existed as a sentient being, you could never become a Buddha. If a Buddha inherently existed as a Buddha, you could never become one. And he says, it's only because things lack that inherent existence that the conventionally existent sentient being can become a conventionally existent Buddha. If they were inherently existent that would mean they would be unchanging. And an ordinary person couldn't realize emptiness and couldn't progress through the stages and couldn't become enlightened. And he says, so, then he has this famous line, he says, where emptiness is possible, everything's possible. If emptiness were not true, then nothing would be possible. So he actually said, it's interesting, because it could seem, again, like he's making the same point Lama Tsongkhapa is making, which is, emptiness is in harmony with how things exist, which is dependent origination, which means they do exist. Does that make sense? Like we could say, well, I mean, actually, because another way of saying what Nagarjuna was saying there is, if the Dharma existed inherently, then it couldn't be shared. Right? Like, it's because the Dharma lacks an inherent existence that we can explain it to each, that the Buddha could realize it, and then could explain it, and could share it with others, and others' minds could grasp it. Because if it were some inherently existent thing, it would have to exist independently of us, and independently of the mind. But the Dharma doesn't exist independently of the mind. It exists, like the Buddha's realization of the Dharma came about through his practice of the path. And then he can explain it to others. And if they practice the path, they can realize it. So one way of saying it is that if the Dharma inherently existed, it couldn't be realized and it couldn't be shared. But because it lacks inherent, because inherent existence means independent, actually, right? If it had some kind of independent existence, then like the Buddha couldn't give it to sentient beings, actually, right? It's because it lacks that kind of independent existence that the Buddha could himself realize it, and then could explain it to others, and then others could realize it, because it's interdependent. So it can be shared with others, and it can be, it can help others progress along a path and transform themselves from an ordinary person into an enlightened being. So it's only because it lacks inherent existence that it can work, actually, to change us and help us grow. Is quite interesting. That's what Nagarjuna would actually say. But I think it's really interesting, because at first you would think, well, the Dharma has to have some kind of inherent existence to work. And Nagarjuna actually says, if it had inherent existence, it couldn't work, actually. It couldn't help anybody. It's only because it's interdependent and interrelational that the Dharma can work on us and help us, because we're interdependent also. And the Buddha is interdependent. As we relate to the Buddha and then relate to the Dharma, we transform. And so it's like, in a way, he's saying, it's because the Dharma doesn't have inherent existence, but does exist conventionally, that it's dependently arisen, and because it's dependently arisen, we can be interdependently relational with it and realize it and transform. So that's Nagarjuna's answer to that question. I think it's really interesting, isn't it? Only interdependent things are effective, isn't it? Like, so, and the Dharma is effective, right? Like in the same way, if there were like an inherently existent food, we couldn't digest it, right? But because food doesn't have inherent existence, it exists, but it's not inherently existence in the form that it's in, then we can eat it and digest it, and we can get nutrition from it. So in the same way, like the Dharma, if it inherently existed, you couldn't take it in, right? And it's only because it doesn't have inherent existence that we can take it in and digest it it can transform us in a way, and we can be transformed in relation to it. Because we're not inherently existent, and the Dharma is not inherently existent, so we can change. You know, we and it can relate and change. It's very interesting to think about. Yeah, inherently existent things would not be effective, actually. They couldn't be relational, so they couldn't affect anything else. It's only things that lack inherent existence, that are interdependent, therefore, and interrelational, that can be effective, whether it's food or dharma or friendships or whatever. All right, well, we should stop there because it's 12:30. But one last thing, I'll just make one last comment. You know, like Lama Tsongkhapa says here, you know, I think it's a danger, so I just want to mention it. Like Lama Tsongkhapa says here, you know, it's difficult to realize emptiness, right? And he's telling the truth. In other words, if it weren't difficult, everybody would already have been enlightened, I think. But I think the danger is, like, so I just want to warn people against, in a way, is that we could become discouraged or something if we're not careful. And so I wanted to make a point, because, you know, we were just quoting Aryadeva, right, in the his 400 stanzas. And so I just want to remind, I actually said this once before, but I'll just remind people last thing today, that in that same text, Aryadeva says, in the 400 stanzas, Aryadeva says, how does he say it? He says, even a mere doubt about this subject tears samsara to shreds. That's actually what Aryadeva says. And what he's getting at, right, is, on the one hand, Aryadeva, Nagarjuna, and Lama Tsongkhapa are saying it's not easy. You know, on the other hand, what they're saying is, even just beginning what we're doing, right, even beginning to sort of contemplate the valid teachings on this topic that come from Lama Tsongkhapa and Aryadeva. Aryadeva says, if you start to think, like as you think about that, you go, wow, maybe things are dependently arisen and therefore don't exist inherently. I think that might be the case. Wow. Like you just think that I have a thought like that, right? Like just a thought, you know. Aryadeva says that tears samsara to shreds, right? And what he's getting at is that's the process that every bodhisattva had to go through. And that every arhat and every pratyeka Buddha had to go through. They had to begin with a question or doubt, right? And then one kind of, continues to kind of go, wow, what does that mean? And then you read a book and you think about it, and you contemplate a little bit, and then you read another book, and you go to a class, and you go to different, and that there's not some other process to become Buddha, actually. That is the process. That's how the Buddha did it. You know, and there are whole, I'll show you this, like there are whole, Khensa Rinpoche told this story, like he points out in the Jataka tales, the previous lives of the Buddha, there are all these stories where like in a whole lifetime the Buddha heard one verse of teaching on emptiness. You know, like, and the Buddha went through some kind of, Khensa Rinpoche tells the story where the Buddha would go through some humongous hardship. And then he would hear one verse that maybe just said like, you know, essentially like, you know, all things are empty of intrinsic nature. And the Buddha would go, what does that mean? You know, or so, like he was not the Buddha yet, right? And that was like that life. And then the next life, like there was a seed, you know, that he would then like, and then there comes a point where because of all these imprints, right, the Buddha eventually realizes emptiness and so on. But that's the process. Does that make sense? So it's a process that takes time, and that each time and it's a really important point, each time you contemplate the meaning of emptiness, you're planting a seed. And because, what does Lama Tsongkhapa say? Cause and effect are unerring, right? So what he's getting at there is also, like in one way it's difficult to realize emptiness. So if you want to do it by tomorrow, it's going to be very difficult. But if you keep planting those seeds, then Lama Tsongkhapa is saying because things are empty of nature, they are cause and effect or functioning. And so if you keep asking those questions and reading books like that or going to classes like that, you attend Khensa Rinpoche's upcoming classes on Majjhimaka or whatever, you know, you do different things, that each time you do that, you're creating an imprint. And then someday, whether it's in this life or in a future life, like, you know, you'll have a dream and somebody will bring you a copy of Buddha Palida's text, you know, or you'll, you know, or some other thing will happen, you know, like, where suddenly you'll realize emptiness. And it's because of the imprints from that you yourself have accumulated over time, because cause and effect are unfailing, right? Cause and effect are what cause things to appear. And eventually those causes will cause the realization of emptiness to appear for you. And if you don't ask these questions, and Aryadeva is implying that, if you don't ever let yourself have those difficult doubts, then that, you won't have that realization, right? Like in other words, we have to kind of go, wow, that's like, you know, when you say like, oh, I wonder if that's true, but it's confusing. That's the doubt, right? That's that R.A. Dave is talking about. Or like, I think this is true, but I don't quite understand it. Like, that's the doubt R.A. Dave is talking about, and that's like the seed that eventually leads you to realize emptiness and become enlightened. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a short question. So we can say that the karma accumulation is because we believe nothing is inherent in existence. That's why we have cause and condition.
Right.
That's why we have karma accumulation.
Exactly.
Everything is inherent existence. There's no karma accumulation. The action will now have result.
Yeah.
You know?
Exactly. Yeah, you're exact. That's exactly what Lama Tsongkhapa is saying. Yeah. So yeah, we should do the. So let's dedicate. Well, first of all, before we do the verses, let's dedicate that through this effort we're all making, right, to contemplate the meaning of emptiness. You know, may it actually result in that, right? Because we can dedicate like that, right? Like through the force of our bodhicitta, and then this contemplation that we're sharing together on the meaning of emptiness. May that result in each of us, like having first a conceptual, correct, you know, realization of emptiness, and then a non-conceptual, direct realization of emptiness, and then through that, may we progress on the path, right, and achieve a state of Buddhahood, and thereby lead all sentient beings to freedom from suffering through these kinds of teachings. So that's one dedication, and then we'll do the other ones. The supreme jewel bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. Actually, and even that verse, right? Supreme jewel bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more, which comes from Shantideva. You know, ordinarily we think of that, which is correct, I mean, it's a correct interpretation, as conventional bodhicitta, right? Which is the wish to achieve enlightenment out of compassion for all sentient beings. But the word bodhicitta can also refer to ultimate bodhicitta, right? Which is the mind of a bodhisattva, right? Actually, what is ultimate bodhicitta? Ultimate bodhicitta is the mind of a bodhisattva, so somebody who has conventional bodhicitta, realizing emptiness, ultimately directly realizing emptiness. So when we say, may the supreme jewel bodhicitta arise and grow and increase, we're also saying, we could say it as, you know, that compassionate wish, but it's also related to what we were studying. We're saying, you know, the ultimate mind of bodhicitta, that mind that out of compassion realizes emptiness in order to achieve enlightenment for all beings. We're also saying, may that increase, right? Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, may it increase more and more, because that's the cause of also Buddhahood, right? We need that for Buddhahood. And so we're making effort to achieve that, and this is that effort, you know, that is, and this effort that you guys are making, that we're making all together, you know, Yue Kinstrom Shu once said, he said, you know, he was kind of pointing out, asking these kind of questions and contemplating these kind of issues, that's the practice of the perfection of wisdom for us. There is no other way to practice the perfection of wisdom, except we ask questions and contemplate, and we like think about difficult topics, and you know, and that's how we increase our wisdom. So that's our practice of the perfection of wisdom. So we're doing that together, so I rejoice.
Thank you, Lord.
Thanks.